Welcome to Story Hour, a virtual meetup hosted by Wolf and Heron.
Thank you, Kara. So I think the story I want to tell is actually, it started with a fascinating conversation I had last week with one of my neighbors. So we were gathering in the neighborhood, just hanging out, talking about what's going on around us. And one of the neighbors asked me, Arman, what do you do for a living? What's your job? And I give them the typical spiel that I usually have off the cuff. I gave her my title, like I'm a clean energy transition advisor. And I got the typical response that I get. It was a complete confusion. It was very clear that it's not clear. And the person said, I understand every single word in your title, but I don't understand what it is that you do. So I followed up by saying I'm an energy consultant. And there was a few nods, but still, so I knew that I have to jump in and provide more clarity around what I do. So I started by explaining that, we are, about the current status of our climate, right? Majority of people understand that climate change is happening. Majority of people know that something needs to be done. And majority of people are on board with doing something. So in majority of times, in most cases, I have a pretty straightforward story. I don't have to persuade people about the fact that climate change is happening. So I piggyback, knowing our neighbors that they are pretty much up to speed, I jumped in and I said, well, climate change is happening. A lot of really bad things are happening around us, from fires to droughts to heat waves to flooding and etc. And we need to make a change. We need to do things differently. And up to that point, it was pretty clear. And then I said, well, when we need to make a change, that's the part that things get tricky. People push back. Policy, politics, corporation, there are various stakeholders that not everyone really is excited about change. There are folks who like the business as usual, but we know that the business as usual doesn't work. So what I do, I help various entities, including investors, corporations, policymakers, states, municipalities, understand the clean energy landscape and make a transition in terms of what they need to do differently. So from there, I think the conversation was pretty straightforward, and I got a few follow-up questions. But one of the questions I got made me ponder, and I've been soul-searching the past week. The person asked me, well, how did you end up there? And at what point in your life did you decide that you want to become a clean energy transition advisor? I gave a response at the moment, but now that I've been thinking about it for a week, I realized that I've been in the energy industry for over a decade. I kind of knew about clean energy and I wanted to be part of this movement. But the question of at what point did you really decide to become an advisor and help entities made me think a lot. And it took me back to what happened in February 2021 in Texas. So as some of you know, we live in Michigan. Michigan in winter is pretty miserable, so it's pretty cold. And we were trying to take advantage of the work remote policy. So we went to Texas for about 3 months, enjoyed the warm weather. Out of these 3 months, I think 2.5 was lovely. The weather was very nice. But we had that storm freeze that happened in Texas. As you may remember, we were without power for 5 days and 5 consecutive days, which makes things much more difficult. And I saw the complete failure of all systems that you rely on firsthand. The power was out for 5 days. Gas was also pretty short. Heating home with gas was not really enough because the system depends on electricity to run gas around the house. The water treatment facilities were without power, so they couldn't treat the water, and the pumps couldn't pump the water. So we did not have water. We ended up collecting rainwater from the backyard to be able to do basic things around the house. And most importantly, the transportation system was also pretty much shut down because we had 1/2 inch of snow and the entire transportation system was unsafe. I don't know if you heard about all the accidents and all the cars getting into pileups around Texas. And the most difficult part was thinking about that nobody expects that to happen in Texas. Texas is the capital of the energy across the world. So nobody imagined Texas running out of power. So that was a moment, I think that was a wake-up call that really made me focus on understanding that climate change, we know that climate change is happening, we know it's here, we know it's going to really negatively impact a lot of people's lives, but the learning point in that moment and the way I ended up in this current role was really realizing that there are not many folks out there looking after us. We typically think that, the government is going to come and save us, or US is a pretty rich country, we have enough resources. And that I realize is not the case, that we cannot really rely on government or rely on corporations or rely on whoever we rely on to come in and save us. So since then, I've been really doubling down on helping anyone who is ready and anyone who asks on how to make the transition. I've wasted years of my life trying to persuade people that climate change is happening and it's going to impact you, and it's not about your grandkids, it's about your own life. And we have an ethical responsibility to do something, even if it doesn't impact you, because it impacts some other countries and other people. But since then, I've kind of switched gear. I don't spend a whole lot of time on getting into these, ideological conversation with people who I know I cannot change their opinion. So I really jump in on having the conversation with clients or with entities or even neighbors who get it and they want to know what they can do. And from there, we had a super productive conversations about how can you increase the resilience. I gave them a free consulting service, essentially, that they would have had to pay a bunch for. But I walked them through all the things that could fail in our neighborhood, what they can do, how much would it cost, what is the payback, what are some of the incentives out there. And I think I was able to help at least one of our neighbors in making the clean energy transition.
Yay! Arman, thank you.
And thank you, Arman, for sharing your story. What
Thank you.
Was powerful about Arman's story? What should he hold on to? Stephanie.
Well, one of the elements that I really liked about your story actually was that it was a story within a story, right? You're talking to your neighbor, and then within that you have several sort of flashbacks and asides and moments. So in some ways that story within a story structure gives you grounding and allows us to kind of be in this scene with your neighbor and come back to that scene periodically. And it feels very like rooted in a time and place for that reason.
Yeah. It's a very relatable task to have to introduce yourself to somebody and explain what you do. That's one of the reasons why tackling this, I think, can be so helpful. What else? What should Arman hold on to? What did you appreciate about the story?
Arman, you are very authentic and natural in your storytelling, like pacing. And even though there was a story within a story, I was clear on where we were at all times. So that wasn't ever confusing to me. So that came across really well.
Mm-hmm. I'll share that I think that the examples that you used in terms of what was happening during the trip to Texas, being able to to share those multiple things that were going on it's much easier to understand and see and feel because you provided those. So I think that especially for a topic like climate change or anything environmental generally, where it can be so scientific, so data oriented, and so abstract, the more that you can have specific examples, whether they be things that happened or metaphors as ways of explaining things, is really helpful in terms of our ability to understand and follow, especially again, for folks that have no are less versed in climate change and the impacts.
I would second that actually, because I think even just the idea of the loss of power, right? We can cerebrally go, oh, I can't use my computer and there's no internet. But like when you talk about the loss of power for multiple days, and the fact that there's a ripple effect on the water system and a ripple effect on like all the other systems that we rely on, and you're like, no, you can't even flush your toilet after a certain number of days. Like then you're like, oh, that's bad, right? And you can talk about like the freezer has thawed, right? And like the things that you think, and I think those details really give weight in a way that not everyone's experienced it or really internalized it until you can make it real like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Super helpful. Thank you.
All right. What are some experiments that Arman could try next time, or things that you would like to hear more of or were curious about within the story?
This may just be because I spend my life interviewing people, but one thing I think would be super interesting, I kept wondering as you were talking, like, it's really clear that experience in Texas was a shift for your focus. What I kept wondering was, like, what did you want to be when you grew up before that? Mm-hmm. Like, I think it would be super cool as a story to hear, like, this is where I thought my life was going, and then this is where this path took me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to build on that, one of the things that makes a story so powerful is having evolution of character, right? And having a person or a hero that is changed fundamentally in the course of the story. And so, Sarah, what you're pointing to here is that in order to have the after, you need to have the before in order to understand that transformation and see that story arc, see that character arc really happen. That's what would give your story a lot of meat. It's an interesting experiment to play with.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe with an interesting twist, I could say that my mom always wanted me to be a doctor. So moving away from that and ending up here was quite a disappointment for her.
Well, rather than taking care of people, you take care of the world.
Yeah, actually, like the theme that came through to me that I wrote down was there's not that many folks looking out for us. And there is, I mean, that feels related in a way. And yeah, that's kind of interesting.
I'm sorry, I'm also moving backwards, but I very much appreciated about your story how passionate you were without being luxury.
Yeah.
It's such a fine line, and it's so easy to cross, but it just made it so real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially with a topic like that. One thought that I had, Arman, is like when you said like the power going out, for example, or needing to go get water. I think the more that you could bring that into a moment of like, I was trying to grab the dog's leash to take the dog out, and I couldn't see because and then I realized, the power has gone out. The more that you can have it be personal to you of like where, when, and how it happened, as opposed to the reporting of, which is a little bit more distant and further away, the more that it'll feel different to us. And this is your experience we're hearing, not that, that's connecting me back to when I remember seeing that on the news.
Yeah. One way to think about that is to really think about what it would look like if it were a movie, right? Because the reporting out, like, I mean, sometimes I guess when you're doing reporting out in a movie, it's like a bunch of headlines, but most of the time it's like a real person in a real moment in a real scene, right? And it's those little details that bring to life the bigger picture. And so it's sort of interesting as a way to kind of be like, well, what if I were going to try to describe this, but using a visual medium instead of my oral medium, like what would I see?
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I think, maybe a feedback I would request is, which part of the story do you think I could cut? Because it was a story within story. So as you saw, I went above the 5-minute limit. So I kind of cut out some of the details, which are going to make the story really beautiful. So thank you for the feedback. But is there anywhere I could have saved some time to squeeze in more details and more of those snapshots?
It's a good question. Any thoughts?
Or it may be a long story, so it may not be a 5-minute story, which is fine.
I think like Arman, when you talked about not needing to persuade and convince people that climate change is real, that's the section you can just kind of bottom line and then move forward. Granted, you have to know who your audience is, right? And some people may not be aware that that was a debate for a long time. That's not crux to your story, so you could shorten that.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd also offer up, I mean, I did say one of the things I really appreciated about your story was the story within the story component. And yeah, I think it might be an interesting experiment for you to try to tell the story just as a story without all of the details about the neighbor and the things that you were, your neighbor giving you a blank stare and et cetera, et cetera. It's like, if you can get your core story tight and succinct, then you can then add back in the story within a story if it makes sense.
Yeah. In some ways, I mean, I would assume that inner story is more useful to you on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. I think back to Sarah's point, if it's like a job interview or like a professional networking event that people end up, if people ask me, how did you end up here? I probably won't tell this neighbor.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It would be more about I think that's really helpful.
Because in some ways, the story within your story was about the evolution of your story.
Right.
Yeah.
And in some cases, if you're giving an interview or something, you're just going to tell the story. You're not going to tell people how your story evolved.
You'll have to come back and share that story with us. Any other thoughts?
It's a work in progress. Yeah.
Yes. Always is.
Always. Stories never stop being works in progress, unfortunately.
Well,
Okay.
Thank you all for the feedback.
Thank you again for sharing your story.
Visit wolfandheron.com to find out more about our story hours.